Hi there, it's Claire. If you're hearing me, that means you're listening to the free preview of one of our Patreon episodes. We switch off every week between free and Patreon exclusive episodes, so if you'd like to hear the rest of this conversation, head over to patreon.com/thisguysucked and join our honorary haters club. A list of sensitive themes and topics covered in this episode can be found in the episode description. Welcome to This Guy Sucked, the show where we prove that it's never too late to have haters and you can't libel the dead. I'm your host, Dr. Claire Aubin, and I'm a historian, writer, and most importantly, certified hater. On this show, we talk about people from throughout history with legacies that need a little updating. Whether it's because of their politics, their behavior, or their impact on society and culture, these guys actually kind of sucked. And we bring in a new scholar every week to tell us why. With me today is Dr. Nicole Cochrane, who is an art historian and curator specializing in the art and material culture of Britain and Europe in the 18th and 19th century. She is currently assistant curator in historic British art, so 1790 to 1850, at Tate Britain, and her most recent book, which is very relevant to today's topic, is an edited collection called Napoleonic Objects and Their Afterlives: Art, Culture, and Heritage, 1821 through the present. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on. I do have a question for you because you post quite a lot online about films and television shows that you're watching, particularly like period shows and period films. Maybe this is difficult. What is your favorite period piece film and why, if you have one?
Oh my god, that's like picking your favorite child. I'll go easy and I'll lowball and I'll say my favorite Napoleon.
Okay.
Is a really bizarre one that I try and get everyone to watch, which is a film, I think it was the 1950s. It's called Desiree, where Marlon Brando plays Napoleon. And it's all about Napoleon's first girlfriend, who is this woman named Desiree Clary. And it's super melodramatic and like there's no battles in it. And Marlon Brando is just like the weirdest choice to play Napoleon. And I love it so much because it's so weird. It's really camp. It's like, if you're going to pick a Napoleon film, that's like the lowest one that actually depicts it. But it's all like conversations in drawing rooms.
I feel like that is also kind of subversive, like having Napoleon and just doing no fighting at all in it and being like, oh, you thought that you knew Napoleon? Well, let's just have him be a guy who talks to strangers and you're listening to his conversations. Do you have a favorite Napoleon, like not the film, but actor who has played Napoleon or depiction of Napoleon, the character / person?
There's so many. So like Napoleon is one of the most filmed people ever. So there's not a lot of like biopics about Napoleon, but Napoleon has been in film since film started.
Whoa.
Like the Lumiere brothers made a short film that featured Napoleon, and he always kind of props up. One of my favorites is Bill and Ted.
Oh yeah.
Just because I think it's so funny.
Of course. When he eats the ice cream. Oh my god, I'm having such a...
And he goes to the water park. It's just like that's called Waterloo.
Yeah. Oh my god.
It's so silly. I think the silly Napoleons are always my favorite because they go to show that how like parodied he is as a figure.
Yeah.
My dream Napoleon, and I shout this from the rooftops, is that I think Kieran Culkin should play Napoleon.
Oh, would be incredible.
Because he's spot on. Like he can play that like weird, like maniacal, but like weirdly charismatic thing that I think Joaquin Phoenix could not do.
Yeah.
So yeah, I petition Ridley Scott to reconsider.
Kieran Culkin, if you ever hear this, first of all, thank you so much for listening to the show. Second of all, you should play Napoleon. If you're out there, or anyone in Culkin Hive, if you're listening, send this to Kieran Culkin and tell him that we want him to play Napoleon. And an expert says he should play Napoleon, which I feel like should put this over. And also, Kieran Culkin, if you're listening and you don't want to play Napoleon, that's okay too. I just wanted to say,
what a coup for the podcast that would be.
That would be wild. Also, yeah, it would be a coup in the Napoleonic sense. That would be if Kieran Culkin, this is a wild thread to be on, but if Kieran Culkin is listening to the podcast right now, I would die. That was like when I found out that Patricia Arquette knows the podcast. I thought I was going to have a fucking heart attack when she was posting about it on her Instagram. I was like, excuse me, Patricia Arquette? Now I call her my good friend, Patricia Arquette. So if you're listening, Patricia Arquette, hello. Shout out to you.
Friend of the podcast, Patricia Arquette.
My very close friend and confidant, Patricia Arquette. Okay, we've gotten off topic. Let's get into what we're really all here for. This probably will not come as a surprise to anyone because we've already talked about this. Who is the episode about today?
So I guess this is like a weird divergence from your normal podcast, because I guess everyone kind of agrees that he sucked. But Napoleon Bonaparte, the kind of maniacal emperor of France, that I feel like everyone, even if you don't know anything about him, people know who he is.
Yeah.
He's kind of, I guess, you could kind of say he's one of the most kind of known figures in human history.
Yeah, I think absolutely.
For better or for worse.
Yeah, 100%. And I also think this is a good opportunity for us to talk about why we pick the people that we pick for the show. Because first of all, we don't pick them. We invite the scholar who picks who they want to talk about. One of the only requirements is that they can't be exclusively famously evil. And Napoleon, I think, is a good example of this, where it's sort of like a lot of people think he sucked, right? But not everyone thinks of him exclusively as like evil or bad, because there are all these other parts of his legacy that are interesting and worth talking about and worth obsessing over and making films over and all of that. In some cases, is also kind of like a tragic figure for a lot of people, and there are a lot of things around him and a lot of narratives around him beyond just him being bad that also still fit with him sucking. And so I think this is a good opportunity for us to be talking about someone who doesn't necessarily have a positive legacy, but still deserves a little bit of nuance in how we think about and talk about him. So I really appreciate you picking him, because we don't actually have to convince people that he sucked. We have to open up their minds to the variety of reasons that he sucked. Does that make sense?
100%. I think he's a figure that even when he was alive, people were debating whether or not he was good or bad. And we always kind of think of him as Britain's greatest enemy, is the narrative I think we like to push a lot. But even at the time, British people thought he was great, thought he was interesting, thought he was bad. He was everything from the Antichrist to like a reformer. And I think even today, like, there are people out there that call themselves Bonapartists.
Yeah.
To this day. It was the anniversary of his death in 2021, and that was the big debate that happened the entire time, is should we be commemorating this? And Emmanuel Macron kind of was stuck in the centre of it. But it's interesting that all this time later, like 200 odd years later, we're still talking about him, which he'd love. He'd absolutely love that we're still debating him.
I mean, to be fair, we've had several people we've talked about several people on the show that were kind of like, they would like that we were having this conversation, actually, that we're talking about them at all, good or bad. That would actually be something they appreciated. Before we go into why he sucked, let's maybe talk about an overview of his life, give people some sort of understanding for people who, despite how famous he is, might not be familiar with this sort of like smaller, more intricate details of his life, or kind of know about one or two events, but don't really know some of the broader strokes that are important. Can you tell me just a little bit about his legacy, his impact on European politics, French politics, society, anything that you think is important for people to know about him?
Yeah, so the broad, I guess, beats of his life is, I guess, the thing that a lot of people find surprising is he's not French. He's born in Corsica, which at the time is in this weird limbo position between Italy and France. His family are ostensibly Italian. His name is Napoleone Bonaparte. All of his family have Italian names that they then turn to kind of the French spelling of. So Luciano becomes Lucian, Luigi becomes Louis, Paulina becomes Pauline. So he lives in this kind of weird state. He, at a very young age, trains in a military academy in France, where he's kind of broadly bullied for being a bit impoverished and not speaking French with a very good accent. He very quickly rises through the ranks. He, without making a podcast entirely on its own of his military kind of tactics, he goes from this kind of lowly, kind of essentially foot soldier to general to what they termed as first consul, which I guess is a term that they kind of made up to be he's kind of a leader in himself. He then becomes first consul for life, which we all know where the trajectory of this goes. Then he becomes emperor.
Yeah.
He then fights a few battles that go badly. As many people know, he tried to invade Russia and it was a disaster. He tries to take over the Spanish peninsula. That's a disaster. And then he fatedly kind of gets the ire of Britain, as we love to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
He's then defeated and exiled. His exile doesn't go well, and he escapes and is then defeated again. And then he is shipped off to the most remote island you could probably find in the world to kind of quietly disappear. And all of this happens very quickly. He dies at only 51. So when you think about that, this is less than a century of time, or just over a century, half a century, he manages to rise to the highest kind of peak as you can and kind of spectacularly falls. And I think part of that is what his legacy is. I think if he had not crashed and burned quite as dramatically, or he would not have been the kind of cultural icon that we talk about as he is, because that was part of the fascination, this idea that I think the tagline of the Ridley Scott film was he came from nothing, he conquered everything, or something like that, which isn't true, because he didn't come from nothing. He was from a noble family, and he didn't conquer everything because he had quite a few spectacular defeats. But this kind of narrative of this, it's the great man of history theory. Like he is the great man of history theory.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
I think one thing that you kind of alluded to, which is funny, and we've actually seen it a couple of times already on the show or seen some manifestations of it, are as soon as you name yourself like first consul for life or like emperor for life or whatever, what you're actually doing is dooming yourself. Like the consequence of that is a short life. Like it's not that the consequence of that is not having a great empire, it's a short life essentially, because nobody wants somebody to be emperor for life. So it is funny whenever we hear something like that. I'm always like, okay, well, we kind of can guess which direction this one is gonna head in. It's happened so many times. All of these sort of great men in history have in some way, or not all of them, but many of them have in some way decided that what their role for the rest of their life was going to be, and the people around them have said, I don't know about that one. No, maybe we'll hold off on this, and then they die basically, because it just doesn't work. For more context, Napoleon is born in 1769, so he is born in the latter half of the 18th century, and he dies in 1821, so the first part of the 19th century. And yeah, so where he grows up until he's about 10 is on Corsica, which Nicole mentioned is this Mediterranean island between France and Italy. It's north of Sardinia. And so a lot of people, you're right, like will sort of not misidentify him as French, but will not understand how the confluence of these two distinct cultural backgrounds and how they intermesh with his family life, with his childhood, all of that, how that all works together to actually paint a better picture of who he is and what his youth looks like. Some other sort of like interesting things around him. These military campaigns are obviously the most famous things about him, but he's also famous for having a lot of very like tumultuous relationships, romantic relationships, having these sort of strange family dynamics, which I think might be something we talk about. I also want to say I went into this episode not knowing what you were going to pick for what was wrong with him, but he's also famous beyond just these like military campaigns that he does and his sort of political power. He's also famous for having all these very strange, like I said, tumultuous relationships, both in a familial and romantic way. His personality and behavior are also big parts of what he's famous for and what this sort of fascination around him relates to, which I think is interesting. What made you interested in Napoleon?
So I kind of came to Napoleon in a weird way, where I did a PhD on art collecting. That was what I was interested in, and I liked the kind of impulse of what made people collecting. And I worked pretty much on the late 18th and early 19th century. And when I was looking at these collections, I kept being like, you would see Napoleon things. There would be maybe a painting, there would be maybe a book or a table, like Empire style furniture is really common. But then the more you look, the more you find weird things like locks of hair, Napoleon loved giving out locks of hair,
Mm.
rings, jewelry, his toothbrush. There's 2 museums that have his toothbrush. There was like this weird fascination with collecting things, particularly after his death. And there's a joke amongst my friends that no matter where I go in the world, I will find Napoleon in a museum, because he is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
There is a Napoleon museum in Rome. There's a Napoleon museum in Cuba. He just, like, his threads spread out across the world, and because he is so fascinating to so many people, that there is just stuff everywhere. And the kind of impulse to collect Napoleon was happening during his lifetime, but still happens to this day. Like, every few years, a bicorn will go up at sale at Christie's that was allegedly owned by Napoleon. His horse, you can see, things like that. And the thing that I find the most interesting is 99% of these things are not military related. And you do see his battle clothes and, as I say, the bicorn, but there's a weird intimacy to the things that we collect about Napoleon. It is the hair, it's the toothbrush, it's the letters to Josephine. I think at one point wine from a cellar of a house he owned went up for sale. It's this weird connection that people find where they want to know the man. And I think that's kind of what Ridley Scott put in his film is we want to get to the heart of who he was, more so than you want to know the broad beats of each military tactic.
Yeah. And there are people who are obsessed with the military part of this. I'm not a military historian, so I don't know a lot of this stuff. But I mean, people are obsessed with that. But I think you're totally right. A lot of what people know about him is about him as a person. And it is interesting, the sort of material remnants that exist in the world. And yeah, beyond the idea that there are Napoleon museums in Cuba and Rome, if you go to any museum, Napoleon will just appear there. There'll be a painting, there'll be an object, there'll be some relationship to him. You know, there are like places where you can find recreations of rooms that he lived in and in his houses and stuff. And it's you're right, he's in every freaking film. Like he's everywhere, so much so that I would say there is a lot of mythology around him, and people are much like Charlemagne, which we've talked about previously on the show. People are so certain of the mythology around him, and they have become so attached to this mythology that they believe is demonstrative of the real person. Like they believe the mythology is real, is who he really was. That a lot of times I assume what historians are having to work against is the mythological Napoleon, and having to reform the narrative around him as a person when people are already, because they're so inundated with information about him, people are already feel very certain of who he was and what he was doing and why he was doing them and what's good and what's bad. So I can see it being like a difficult thing to tackle because everybody feels like they already know him and know about him, except me. Because, like I said, I don't know that much. I didn't go into this knowing that much about him because this time period is very much a historical blind spot for me in terms of expertise. Thanks for listening to this preview of a Patreon exclusive episode. To subscribe and listen to it in full, head over to patreon.com/thisguysucked.